So in the previous video, we talked about what to write for the first few paragraphs of this essay, which covers the theories and explanations. And now in part 2, we will focus on evaluating the two policies. So let's get right into it. The first policy I'm going to talk about is indirect taxes. So in this paragraph, you will first write the definition of the indirect taxes and then write an example of how the government or when the government imposed indirect taxes on cigarettes, which is the example that we used throughout the essay. So the second thing that you have to do after outlining a real-world example of indirect taxes is explain how the MPC curve is affected by the tax. Now, I will not go into details about the explanations themselves, but I will outline what you have to write in this paragraph. So the third thing is, how have prices and quantities changed in the market? Describe that the quantities consumed and produced have decreased, and explain what prices consumers now pay and producers now receive. So the fourth thing is explain the state of allocative efficiency in the market. In other words, show that MSC is now equal to MSB. After explaining the effect of indirect taxes on negative externalities of consumption, it is then time to evaluate this policy. There are two things to bear in mind. First, your example has to be permeated throughout your explanation. And second, it is always good to have a balanced argument where you do 3 advantages and 3 disadvantages for every policy that you evaluate. So I'm going to start with the 3 advantages of indirect taxes. So the first one that I have is taxes are a source of revenue for the government. So in this paragraph, you will outline how much revenue the government actually received from imposing the indirect tax in your real-world example. Then explain that because the government received increased revenue, it can use it to contribute to healthcare or education services that elevate the well-being of citizens. Make sure that your advantages or your benefits are actually directed towards some sort of a stakeholder. So the second advantage is that the tax internalizes the externality. Before the tax, the social costs of the externality are actually incurred on the society. The smokers themselves are not responsible for paying for the costs. However, the taxes increase the prices paid by consumers, and this means that the smokers are now responsible for paying an extra amount for their irresponsible smoking behavior. Note that in order to illustrate the actual effectiveness of the internalizing effect of the tax, you have to write down some real-world figures of how smoking per capita has decreased in response to the implementation of the indirect tax. So the third advantage is rather straightforward. The tax gains support for the government. So the tax demonstrates that the government is actively raising awareness on the state of public health and taking the well-being of citizens into consideration. Remember to refer back to your real-world example and explain how the government received public support by implementing the tax. Okay, now let's move on to the disadvantages. So the first one is that it's hard to identify an ideal tax rate. Since the tax is imposed on cigarettes with the intention of eliminating external costs, massive time and effort is needed to measure and track the actual economic costs and the societal consequences of smoking, which can be arbitrary and ambiguous. The consequence is that the after-tax MPC might not intersect MPB at the optimum quantity, and it is difficult to reach allocative efficiency. The second disadvantage is that there are high administration costs. If you go onto the websites for the World Trade Organization, you can find actual figures for the administration costs of governments implementing different types of taxes, including indirect taxes on tobacco or cigarettes. So the third disadvantage is that the tax might not be effective due to tobacco addiction. So write down some real-world figures of how an increase in the price of cigarettes has insufficiently decreased consumption. Because many smokers will still buy cigarettes despite it being more expensive, it makes the indirect tax ineffective. So the second policy is negative advertisements. There are many federally funded anti-smoking ad campaigns that you can write about. The advertisements will decrease demand for cigarettes. It will shift the demand curve to the left until MPB is equal to MSB, and consumption once again takes place at the optimum quantity, QOPT. Okay, now you start to evaluate the negative advertisements with advantages. First, it is easy to implement. You don't have to spend time or effort to determine the size of the external costs. The government can incentivize consumers to decrease consumption of tobacco simply by airing the advertisements. In this paragraph, write down some real-world figures of how many cigarette smokers have quit because of an ad campaign. There are plenty of statistics online. So the second thing is that the advertisements can actually effectively reduce the external costs because it shifts the demand curve to the left. The external costs per unit is actually lower than before. So in this paragraph also outline how many smokers have quit because of the advertisements. So the third advantage is that the advertisements can also gain support for the government. The campaigns would show that the government is actively concerned about smoke-related diseases amongst citizens, which helps establish a good political image. Okay, now let's move on to disadvantages. First, there are opportunity costs arising from the advertising campaigns. For example, the government expenditure could have been directed at supporting institutes such as the National Cancer Institute, which requires funds for research and development to directly tackle the external costs of smoking in the form of tobacco-related cancer. Next, the advertisements are ineffective in the short run. Deciding to quit smoking is a long-term process that cannot be incentivized with short periods of advertisements. So the government must keep funding the advertising campaigns in order to realize more significant results. So finally, we have again, advertisements are ineffective to those who have addiction to cigarettes. So this will follow approximately the same explanation as the one we did for the indirect taxes. So combining part 1 and part 2, I have explained how to structure the essay of evaluating two policies to reduce negative externalities of consumption.